First news story, I guess, has to be Alan Wake 2, which, well, we were expecting great things from it, but I think the bottom line is that it's not just a technological showcase, but the review reactions to the game
Yeah.
have been absolutely phenomenal. Metacritic is currently above 90. There's a huge array of 10 out of 10s, 9 out of 10s for the game. I've got to say, I'm hugely thrilled for Remedy. This is richly earned, richly deserved. The game is incredible. Certainly, in terms of Digital Foundry's sort of audience statistics, based on just the first video we put up, stacked up against our first Spider-Man video, it's right up there. So
Yeah,
this
right.
is like
it's a big game.
That's awesome.
this is just incredible.
Yeah.
John, I'm going to go to you first. Let's talk about the game just generally, first of all. Obviously, it's now weapons free. We can say whatever we like about it. What would you like to say? What's your big takeaway for Alan Wake 2?
Okay, there's three sort of, let's bust out the John pillars, shall we? There's three pillars on which this game is built that I find very compelling. There's the visual side, there's the game itself, and then there's the storytelling, right? And I think
Yeah, I know what you mean.
it really nails these three elements in ways that are both expected as a Remedy fan, but also surprising as one as well, which is what I didn't expect. So obviously, well, let me just start with the other stuff first, then we'll get to the graphics. I'm a big fan of what Remedy's always done. They always try to sort of pull the rug out from under the player, introduce fun new concepts, and sort of take you down this road of what's going on. That sense of like confusion and wanting to know more. You see interesting visual designs, just things that pop into the story. Strange things happen. You don't understand what's happening. Games are the perfect medium for this. This is something that used to be more common in games, actually. I mean, this is one of the reasons I was a big fan of, like, say, the Metal Gear games, because they were all about this kind of stuff. Silent Hill does this as well, and Remedy has always been great at it. And Alan Wake 2 really pushes this to the next level, because you're playing between these two characters, Saga and, of course, Alan Wake himself. And, of course, Max Payne is in there as well, with Mr. Casey, I guess, actually. And it's kind of one of those games where there's layers of reality that you're exploring, and the game takes you on this journey through these different layers, and it slowly peels them back, leaving you in this state of confusion, yet amusement, if you will. And I just find that stuff really compelling. Like, it's much more so than Alan Wake 1. Alan Wake 1 plays well, but it's actually my least favorite of Remedy's games, I would say. Because I feel it got very repetitive. You're just running through the landscapes for like hours, shooting the same guys over and over and over again. It gets very tedious, I thought, even though the core mechanics are good. Alan Wake 2 is nothing like that. In fact, it's so different that I was actually a little bit surprised, where, especially early on, it starts more as almost an adventure game. There's dialogue choices, there's exploration, you're piecing together puzzles, you're going into sort of like figure out the crime scene, if you will, and all this kind of stuff. And then obviously Alan comes into the story, and he too is figuring out like what's actually happening here. And slowly but surely they introduce more shooting into the game, but it's just this feeling of spiraling through some kind of like portal into madness, and I love that stuff. But obviously, the big thing for the Digital Foundry side is the visuals. And I'm just going to say it right now, Alex. I don't want to spoil things too much, but I'm going to spoil it. This is the best looking game of the year. And probably one of the best looking games ever made. This is a technical showstopper. And I would say both on consoles and the PC, which wasn't the case, I would say, with Cyberpunk 2077, which we awarded our Graphics of the Year award in the past. That was just for the PC version. And while the PC version definitely is a step above, I think they actually did do a great job with the console version as well. And it's really just, it's about the lighting model here, especially on PC. But wow, the path tracing, just the way, like, there's the way ambient light spills across the scene, and sort of like you can almost feel the photons moving through the world, bouncing off the surfaces. It truly demonstrates the whole concept of the world as just a series of mirrors that are more or less rough, because everything is reflective, as it should be, from the most like the roughest surface to like the most mirror like sheen. Everything reflects correctly, and
Awesome.
it's not always in your face necessarily. It's often more subtle, but like once you notice it, it just starts to feel somehow more realistic in a way that I'm not used to seeing in video games anymore. So, or anymore, I say, I mean, that I'm not used to seeing in video games, full stop. So there's a lot to do with this, and I actually want to hear some other thoughts here. So, Alex, was hältst du von Alan Wake 2?
Das allerbeste Spiel meines Lebens. No, well, it is very good. I don't know if I'd call it the best game I've ever had in my life, but it is incredibly well made in a lot of ways. And just to talk about the technical things, I think John hit it the nail right on the head there about being accomplished technically across all the platforms. We have yet to see Series S, though, as
true.
of typing this, so I can't say too much about that. But I presume Series X will be right up there with PlayStation 5. Maybe it'll have differences in performance, kind of like we saw in Control when that released. I can't say anything about that yet because I haven't tested it.
There's no photo mode in this game, though, Alex.
That was one thing that so disappointed me while doing this, because I wanted to I want to see what I can do next week, because I'm going to be working on another video covering the path tracing and ray tracing recommended settings and all those kind of things, and maybe a little bit more holistically about the game. But I want to show like how dense like the geometry is, how dense the lighting interactions can be, but your camera only gets so close, you know? And that's a bit of a bummer always. So I'm gonna have to see what we can. I don't know.
It's got to be that Control thing when you highlighted the performance difference between the consoles using photo mode.
Yeah, it's got to be
and that was very controversial. There was lots of comments like,
"We're benching photo mode here.
Benching photo mode. What are you guys doing over there? Bunch of jackalopes."
We should. It should be pretty easy to see any performance differences right in the beginning of the game, if there's any between Xbox Series X and PS5, because there's bits in the beginning of the game that not the very very beginning, but the forest sections in the game are heavier than other sections. And I think that's borne out a bit in some of the benchmarking that's being done, where if you benchmark like the town or some areas where Alan Wake is, there's not the like. Vegetation is always really expensive to render, so it's definitely expensive here as well too. But on the technical level, it looks really good on any platform currently that I've seen that you can play it on. The lowest settings on PC are like the high settings in other games, and I think that's one thing that we'll talk about a little bit later, where even if you turn down the settings in this game, you're going to get a really good looking game. And that isn't the case for everything. It wasn't the case in the original Crysis. You turn on the graphics in the original Crysis, they scaled to like lower than Far Cry. It didn't run that well always, but you could really make that game super ugly on the low settings.
Yeah.
Here, the low settings only go so far because they want to keep obviously a lot of the artistic value in the game without letting you go full potato mode. But it still runs really well, I would say, given the hardware. They're also using mesh shaders or primitive shaders on PlayStation 5. And actually, when we were at Gamescom, I did talk with Tatsu Alto about this, who was their TD, technical director, and he mentioned that they were using mesh shaders, or the equivalent of primitive shading, on PlayStation 5, which is something that RDNA 1 has. It's very close to mesh shading, just doesn't have like the amplification stage. That's about it. And they're using to fine-grain colorway geometry using meshlets, which is a way to like break up the geometry of an object so you can get like really like fine understanding of where the vertex edges are and where the geometry is, so you can color away the stuff you don't see, the player doesn't see. This is all good stuff, because that means you can pump up the geometric quality everywhere across the world. And I think that's really evident in Alan Wake 2, where almost every object you walk up to, it's super dense in terms of geometric quality. It's one of the first things that I noticed, not in the opening cutscene, but the one thereafter, just like a lot of the stuff going on. And that's without even talking about the path tracing. I'm just very happy with the technical quality of the game at release. And that is in spite of the, I would say, like, feverish hate that the game got for putting out recommended specs. There's a lot to talk about that, Rich. I don't know. Do you want to say something about the recommended spec situation?
Yeah, I mean, basically, and I think Remedy itself said post embargo that they were somewhat conservative with their kit recommendations. The minimum kit requirement on the AMD side is the RX 6600, which I find to be a really interesting GPU because, you know, there's not so many decent GPUs you can buy these days that are sub $200. This thing's been as low as 180 for ages, right? And so, you know, this is a minimum spec GPU, which Remedy has specified. So I thought I'd give it a go. And I'm not going to make it easy on the GPU here. I just dialed in exact PlayStation specification settings for the quality and the performance modes. So, you know, basically it's like 1270p, medium, high, low hybrid for the quality mode, and FSR2 scaling up to 4K. Performance mode is basically minimum settings. 1440p output, I think it's 870p internal resolution. And, you know, bearing in mind, you know, it's not going to be as good as a PS5, right? But it's not a million miles away. So, you know, that quality mode alternative, a 6600 is not a 4K card, but this is what we're forcing it to do. Still doing 27 frames per second average across this sort of foliage heavy bench. Can go lower, of course, it can go higher. But, you know, it's not bad. The performance mode equivalent, basically 52.9 FPS. So, you know, that's just kind of nuts.
That's good.
For, you know, bearing in mind, Remedy are specifying like 720p 30 on low for this GPU, I believe, based on the recommended specs. It's obviously much higher. You also see there that I've done a third run, which is essentially 1080p FSR2 quality mode, which is kind of what you would be using this GPU for. And I believe it's the quality mode. I'd need to check, but it's 56.2 frames per second there. And, you know, that's for a 1080p GPU. That sits well within the VRR window on a 60 hertz display. This is really good stuff. So, yeah, I do think they were somewhat conservative, which might have stoked some of the hate in terms of the specifications.
Man, I hate to use that word hate though. It's more just like people being upset that their systems can't run a game, and I understand where they're coming from. But
was that it though? But was that it? I think it was more about no. So like I really think it was a very low amount of people being like, I have a 1070 and I want to play this game. I think a lot of the comments I saw were about
a very different discussion.
Yeah, I think a lot of the comments were about, I'm playing at 1080p performance mode on a 3070, which is what it said. It was basically saying like, one, DLSS, FSR2 are recommendations here, and the concept of what is medium was very insulting as well to I think a lot of people that read those specs and then commented on it.
Okay, so
that's what I read.
It's the age-old problem of they don't like the names of the presets. I did actually see, if we do want to use the word hate, I did see some thrown around towards reconstruction. People are just really anti DLSS and FSR, and I just don't get it because they take
it's
over.
It's going to be one of these TAA situations where people are just going to accept it over time, simply because guess what, guys? If you want a big leap in fidelity, if you want the developers to aim high, you've got to understand that it's about quality of pixels, not quantity of pixels. And yes, upscaling techniques are the mitigation strategy to make it work.
But they look,
and it's not as if it's a bad looking game. Right?
Well, I was going to say, it's like specifically with DLSS, I think DLSS often looks better than the native solution, like a native res TAA solution, because it takes over the TAA duties basically. And I think it does a better job at creating a more consistent, coherent image. With really clean edges, especially on very fine detail.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but Remedy have actually dumped their own TAA solution and their own upscaling solution, and effectively you need to use FSR2 as a baseline for upscaling, right?
This is very true, and also so there was some reporting out there that the game forces you to use DLSS or FSR2. That isn't completely correct in the aspect of is you can always run the native resolution of both it using DLAA and or FSR2 native AA, which is the new mode for FSR2 that I think that was a Gamescom thing. So you can always run the game at native resolution. It's just a matter of whether or not it's worth it to run it at that native resolution, given what it's giving you in comparison to other graphical features you can tweak. And that's always like the thing. Like, obviously, adding more pixels is going to somehow increase quality if you're comparing baselines of the same AA technique in use. But is it worth it in comparison to having, for example, would you rather have slightly lower pixel density, or would you have reflections not disappearing off on screen? You know, like turning on SSR versus turning on RT. Like, what is more important to you as a player? And the options allow you to do that in this game. And I think people freaking out about the settings, we'll talk about mesh shaders, whatever, later maybe, but at least in regards to what is medium is just an arbitrary word to describe anything. They, for whatever Remedy decided, they said medium is actually like a mix of high settings and ultra settings and medium settings. And some of those settings are much more expensive than others, right? So
yeah,
that's the way it is. I don't know what else to say about it, but as a result,
they kind of handicapping themselves there though by calling medium, but then using a mix of settings within the preset, because it's just a wording thing. It's just a wording thing. Although I wish they had gone all the way though and added like a potato mode. It's like the low end. Which, unfortunately, thinking of potatoes, I did see some people testing it, trying to get it to run on Steam Deck, and thus far, I have not seen anyone succeed with this.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, that'd be really hard to get it running on Steam Deck because the game is ridiculously GPU heavy. And I think then it would also start maybe taking away clocks from the CPU at that point. So you might start running into other issues. It's really, with those power constrained devices, it's really hard to throw ridiculously heavy content at them and get really good performance everywhere across the entire experience.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. There is an extra wrinkle. I mean, we'll talk about the mesh shader thing because I do think it is worth discussion, Alex, because, fundamentally, we've kind of realized that there is a day of reckoning upon us where older GPUs are not going to be able to effectively run new games. But I'm not sure anybody ever predicted that it would be mesh shaders that would be the defining factor that separates one generation of GPUs from the prior one. I actually did some testing for you, and it's with 1080 Ti, 5700 XT, and I put the 2080 in there as well. The 2080 seems to, I think, generally underperform based on what it should be doing, possibly, but it does have the mesh shaders, and it annihilates the 1080 Ti. 5700 XT seems to be, well, it's still obviously not running anywhere near as well as a PS5, but, it seems to be doing a bit better. One thing I did want to test, though, and I actually did this just before the Direct and shared with you some results, Alex. The 1660 Ti, which is this kind of weird Turing card that didn't have RT or tensor cores, it does have mesh shading. And you can, in that, again, that foliage-heavy sequence, it averaged 42.94 FPS, 1080p FSR2 quality mode, but running on PS5's performance mode presets, which is effectively as low as they go across the board. It's perfectly playable on this really old GPU. It's just because the mesh shading part of it is in there, which I found quite interesting. But again, it's still massively outperforming what what Remedy is saying a 6600 could do, 720p 30.
So wait, Rich, I maybe I blanked and missed it, but if you try to run this on a card without mesh shading support, what happens?
It does run.
It does run,
but it's very, very poorly usually.
Basically the 5700 XT seems to be about, I'd say, sort of 50% of where you would expect it to be. And the 1080 Ti, which should be faster, I think, than the 5700 XT.
Yeah.
It's just really, really running bad. Okay. There's some really weird stuff going on. You go into the mind place and it drops down to like 12 frames per second, 12 to 15 frames per second. There's some weird stuff going on with Pascal. Pascal's really not doing well.
So I'm actually curious because I know the mind place is resident in the memory when you're playing the game.
Wait, isn't it the mind palace?
I think that's Sherlock Holmes, isn't it?
They've tweaked it. They say in the when you first access it, hey, I've done my own version of the Mind Palace.
Okay. So they didn't keep the same name, right? Okay.
No.
But I'm wondering if it's actually something that's off the map, off the side of the map. And because they don't have the mesh shaders doing the culling anymore, it's just like doing a really bad culling, and you're actually rendering like the entire game alongside of it, like behind it. You know, that's something that could actually happen. I could imagine if you're not using mesh shaders.
But the 5700 XT holds up fairly well on that. So yeah, it is a weird thing for sure. But basically, you know, when they say when that little error pops up saying you don't have mesh shaders, this is generally a bad thing. But, you know, if you do have mesh shaders, and I include the 1660 Ti in there, 1660 Super, any of those old Turing cards without the RT cores, you should be kind of able to get something fairly decent out of it, I think, you know, bearing in mind that this is a really GPU-heavy game. But yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Do you want to say anything more about mesh shaders, Alex? It is a bit weird that it would be mesh shaders that are that kind of dividing factor.
I didn't expect that to come first before an RT game just blowing everyone out of the water. But it is so fundamental to the drawing of the game's rendering. Like it's like, how do we do geometry? Do we use the old system, which has existed since DirectX 9? With some modifications in DX10 and 11, or do we use something that is entirely programmable and very different and gives us more control and potentially quite a bit better performance? And they made that leap. A lot of other devs haven't. Another engine that has technically made the leap but offers a vertex based, they have a fallback that is semi-performant is Unreal Engine 5. Unreal Engine 5 actually uses mesh shaders too for the triangles that are bigger than, like, I forget how many pixels. But this is the first time we've seen a game actually do this in a while, and I'm very happy to see it. Like, I don't get teary-eyed when a 7-year-old GPU can't run the game. I just don't anymore. The 5700 XT is an interesting one. Rich pointed out the fact that its performance is semi-okay, all things considered. But I mean, back when
literally semi.
Yeah, it's
half.
It's like half. Yes, semi. But that one is one where back when that GPU came out, I think there was enough press at the time that said it doesn't have a lot of features that the competition has. And that was actually part of the review process back then. And there was an asterisk, I think, on the review saying, like, you won't be able to use these things eventually. And this is the first time we're seeing it. I don't think every title's going to do this, people. Like, Alan Wake 2 is... Remedy is... Yeah. It's a special thing. Like, it's going to take a little bit longer before we see mesh shading. It took this long. It took 5 years after the introduction of mesh shading to get the first title to actually really even use it. Like, wow. Like, that's so long in terms of DirectX time. Usually these things are like 1 year, a little less. So... it's the first one of hopefully many over time, but I think Alan Wake 2 is going to be special for a bit, and then like maybe 2 or 3 years we might see another title. We'll see.
Rich, remind me here, did you test the Radeon 7? I think that's the most important one to know. I mean, that was the same year as the 5700 XT, I think, but it's like,
it is.
I think it's an older generation, or is it?
I mean, it's basically a die shrunk Vega.
Oh, right? Yeah.
It is using the Vega architecture. It's GCN. It's old.
It's real.
I mean, I might, you've piqued my interest.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it does have 16 gigs of memory, but weirdly enough, Alan Wake 2 seems to be quite, as long as you turn off ray tracing,
it's very memory efficient.
Seems to be,
right.
Yeah, very memory efficient, which I thought is quite interesting. Yeah, I could give the Radeon 7 a go. That's just to see what happens there. I mean, it would be sort of like a faster Vega 64, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's just been really interesting to see this dividing line between, GPU generations. And there is the whole question. I mean, there's no doubt that there's still millions of 10 series cards in circulation. But at some point, they're not going to be good enough. Yeah. Right. I mean, that's the bottom line. And, it's kind of akin to, you're not going to, if you're sitting there with your PlayStation 4 that you bought in 2016, you're not going to be playing Alan Wake 2 either.
No, I think the 1080, the 10 series cards have had an exceptionally long life for PC hardware. up there. I would
Ridiculously
argue
long.
with, like, I don't know, famous cars like the 8800 GT maybe, or I don't know. There's been others along the way that have been like this, but it's a great car that has been very long lasting. The GTX 970 that
Also,
Yeah,
long
that
that's a
lasting.
lasted
classic.
for a while. That was a classic. And the 1080, yeah, the 1080 is an amazing
Yep.
card. It's gotten, you've had 7 solid years, and it's not over yet, right? Like, just because a game like this comes along and doesn't really
One
work
title.
on it doesn't mean that
Yeah.
that's going to be the case going forward for every game, right? It's just, it's starting to show its age, but it's still perfectly usable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I was kind of, I was intrigued to see the actual PC results that were coming out based on the fact that the recommended specifications were very onerous,
Yeah.
and they did cause some concern. I guess the the funny thing is that the whole mesh shading thing came out as a kind of PS in a tweet from a Remedy staffer,
Yeah,
as opposed to being a part
Right.
of the whole spec sheet. So that was a bit of a bolt out of the blue.
Actually,
I think the bottom. I think the bottom line though is that in terms of scalability, there is scalability here. It is decent, but there is very much a cutoff point where, unlike many games, there is no potato mode here.
Right.
If you whack down everything down to low, it's still recognizably Alan Wake 2. It is basically the PlayStation 5 version in performance mode.
Right.
It looks, with a couple of extra tweaks here and there, but it still looks really, really good. So, it's sort of 6 of one, half dozen of the other, really, where it is a graphically intensive game. And, maybe some people are hearing, 1080p with upscaling, low settings on a 1660 Ti, it's 42.9 frames per second. That's pretty low, but it's not when you actually see what low settings is. So, really interesting.
For me, it's like beyond the GPU requirements and all that, I just want to say that the experience of loading this up on PC was one of the most positive I've had in a while, where
Right.
I fired it up, it loads super fast, there's no weird stuttering, hitching, anything strange. I mean, I literally just started the game first time, I'm using a high-end card, so I put max settings and decided, let's see what happens. And then I continued to play after that point. I didn't have to restart the game. I didn't have to fiddle with anything. It just worked. No hitching, no weirdness, none of the typical stuff we often see with day one PC releases. The whole thing just felt like rock solid and awesome, which I think is an impressive feat, especially in 2023, where that cannot be assumed with a new
It is
PC
not
release.
assumed. No. I still have yet to try. I mean, you tried the RTX 2080, Rich. I'm going to drop the RTX 2070 Super, and at some point, maybe it doesn't make it into the video, depending on how much time I want to spend before I get it out, because it's almost ready. It's like the video is almost ready. But maybe that could be thrown into the article. But I'm just very curious about how the RTX 2070 Super fares against the PlayStation 5, because we've seen that, depending on the title, it's like up, down, it's below it. It really depends on the
testing
title,
I did
right?
for you was before we had finalized console settings, right? So it was on medium settings, which is actually quite demanding.
Yeah, the high post processing setting, the high post processing setting is super expensive, and you probably don't need it. Just gonna throw that out there. It's one of the things that drags down performance a whole lot, just for like better looking depth of field. That's the big difference. So
It is good. It is good looking depth of field, though. Let's be
it is.
honest.
It's also it's high. It's full resolution, which it wasn't actually in Control. So there's like a lot of things that are subtly better in Alan Wake 2, other than just geometry and stuff like that. Just like the post processing is higher quality in Alan Wake.
The other thing to mention is the ray reconstruction, DLSS 3.5.
Right.
We thought it did an amazing job at Gamescom, but I noticed with Cyberpunk, when it actually did hit, there is this sense that it adds an almost AI upscaled watercolory look to the visuals that I always found slightly off-putting. So it has its benefits, but it didn't look as good as I had hoped in practice. But in Alan Wake 2, it works flawlessly, where the image just feels rock solid. It doesn't have any of that weirdness. Obviously, it eliminates all the fizzle and other issues that it's designed to do. And it really showcases that, maybe the Cyberpunk implementation needs a little bit more work. to get to
Yeah,
this
it's
point,
very
and that
curious,
it's
right?
I'm not really sure what's going on there, but it's definitely noticeable, the difference.
Could it be content? I mean, Alan Wake is
I know.
fundamentally a slower game, right?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's hard to say.
It's hard to say too, because I thought about this a bit. I was like, "Oh, maybe there's less lights in Alan Wake 2 is one thing I thought of too. So there's less noise to deal with for certain areas. I don't know, but also the model is probably evolving to a little degree, and maybe it currently fits some content better than others. It's really hard to tell. I would have to send a couple of questions over to NVIDIA to get an idea. But since it is a black box, it's pretty much impossible to know. So
Right.
Well, let's round off this discussion with a supporter question. This one from Roel. Hi, DF crew. The recent drama surrounding Alan Wake 2 requiring a GPU with mesh shader support made me wonder when we might see other technologies that are currently optional become mandatory. I guess the most obvious one here would be RT. So at which point do you think that developers might start to make RT the only option for certain graphical features without non-RT fallbacks? Could Spider-Man 2's inevitable PC port in a year or two require RT, given how it is used across all modes in the PlayStation 5 version? Or do you think Nixis will still be adding some fallbacks for older hardware? Well, Alex, and indeed John, I think that Spider-Man 2 already has those fallbacks in PlayStation 5. They're just not used.
technically,
For
yes.
reflections.
Yeah. They use it for
that's
secondary
actually quite
reflections,
interesting.
as we know.
Yeah.
I mean, in the first version of your review video for Spider-Man 2, John, you actually found a part of the game that was still using screen space reflections.
Yeah, cube maps.
Cube maps. Yeah, but they actually patched it. You had to edit the video.
Yeah, I edited the video. They fixed that in a patch. I had to remove that
Sorry,
part.
John.
Yeah, so there's definitely still fallbacks in place. The question, I guess, is how they're generated, if it's the same way as it worked before. Because if they kind of like push that out of the pipeline as of January of this year, one has to wonder how good that fallback system actually would be when used across the entire game. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a fair point. Yeah, I mean, Alex, Nixis are the masters of fallbacks and supporting older hardware, really, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, maybe if they do want to support something like Steam Deck or ROG Ally, they would do this, and they maybe would go in there with some QA and art to fix it up, because they've gone in there with art before to fix things up. They do it for their 21:9 and 32 whatever modes they put in their games, to clean up both UI as well as any of the cutscene issues that could appear in these games. So they do art changes for these games, Nixies. They're not just a straight porting studio. And I could almost feasibly see them doing that. But at the same time, like I said, I think it was a couple DF Directs ago, it's going to be maybe 2 years from now. It would be interesting if it was actually like a year from now. That'd be very interesting. But I imagine it's still going to take longer just because this is the way things are. And by then, we're going to have so many years of real-time ray tracing existing that I would hope we start seeing some titles just say, actually, we don't want to spend the QA time doing this. Actually, just use an RT card. I mean, if the consoles can do it by that point, and they'll be XX so old by then, why can't your PC?
No,
Well, 5 years old.
I would,
in 2 years' time.
I would love it if somebody tried to troll the users with the fallback, and all the fallback textures are just like the "you didn't say the magic word" Jurassic Park gif, and you just see that in all the reflections. It's just that tiled.
Oh, I mean, that'd be great. I love that.
That would not go over well, I think.
That would not go well.